Entering Twoson, the player is immediately greeted with music invoking many bittersweet feelings, both demonstrating the distance the protagonist is feeling from his hometown already, and showing a clear change in the tone of the adventure, eliciting feelings of the road's only going to get tougher from here. The nearby friendly mole has some interesting things to say. Point to be taken away is that the text lets the player know that humans with weird colored faces, the blue ones, are enemies, as is to be seen with the crooked cops, the rambling men, cranky ladies, and worst of all, hippies. South from here, the path leads the player into town, continuing with the precedent Onett established for how towns are laid out. This nearby girl NPC will tell the player about the town. She starts with a hotel to subtly remind the players to save and heal. The hospital then lists all of the significant locations in the area: the Chaos Theater, Polestar Preschool, the bus station, Berkland Park, and a place called Happy Village on the outskirts of town. Oh, and a pizza parlor. These locations are all important for a new player to know because, something's wrong. The controls are inverted, or are they? They switched again. The mushroom. Yep, we're mushroomized. Not only does it mess with you on the overworld, but makes battle practically impossible. So first things first, we need to get rid of this thing. But where do we even do that? The previously mentioned hospital has a healer with blue hair that will purchase it from the protagonist for $50. Neat, but I think that this is a very unclear answer to new players. While yes, their first inclination would probably be to go to the hospital, likewise they'd also probably think, to go to the nurse or the doctor. Yeah, I guess he sticks out in the hospital, but up to this point we've seen NPCs of all shapes and sizes, so his blue hair really isn't as clear of a giveaway as perhaps the designers thought. Anyway, with that out of the way, the map shows that Twoson is actually even more linearly laid out than Onett was, with everything on the top row being completely optional. The player's first stop will probably be the hotel, since it's where you can save for free and it's the first building you see when entering town. Again, to remind the player to save and heal. Staying at the hotel will trigger a cutscene to play where the protagonist receives a telepathic message from none other than our female protagonist. It's short, and it's a nice piece of direction for the player, as the objective in Twoson may not be immediately clear for newcomers, unless they really remember what a handful of NPCs in the last town mentioned while carrying out other objectives. Something else about hotels I haven't mentioned yet are the employees who will read you the newspaper outside your room. The paper's publishers and headlines are specialized to each town and update pretty much after every objective. It's a really niche thing I don't ever really see people checking, but wanted to point out due to the extent it really brings the world to life, making it feel like time is progressing and things really are changing as you go. This hotel specifically also houses one of my favorite NPCs in the game. This guy, who if you won't stop talking to him, will eventually give you $50, essentially netting the player a free stay in the hotel. A nice little thing to reward the player for talking to NPCs multiple times, and is likely intended to be a nice gesture since most players will only see this guy if they stay the night in the hotel. And in the room next door is this poor man. Over here, outside the hotel is, a photo op. The cycle shop, Puncture, a wonderfully translated joke may I add, lends the protagonist a free bike. The store clerk informs you, however, that you can't use it with another person or even a teddy bear, which, not to get too ahead of myself here, but will be the case in the very near future. It's an odd place for it, and generally makes traversing many areas actually more difficult due to its size. But look at how happy it makes him. The theme is also kickin' too. Really jolly and is really just a nice break from everything around you. The bike also gives the controller its sole use for the R button in the entire game. The bell! We'll return it for now. In case the player hasn't seen the telepathy scene, or has forgotten what NPCs in Onett had mentioned, plenty of people around town will reiterate the importance of the female protagonist, that she's been getting mixed up with weird crowds, and that she lives with her parents at Polestar Preschool. The department store is a nice hub of shops so the player can upgrade their equipment, restock their items, and not have to go to multiple stores, though the escalator takes a while. It also allows players to return items, which is just a fancy way of saying sell them, but I rarely see anyone bring this up, so I wanted to mention it. I like this NPC a lot. This big macho guy with sunglasses saying how much he misses his mom is just humorous, and actually helpful information for when the player eventually experiences homesickness, a status ailment that only affects the main character. While we're at it, the mom has a lot of varying flavor text throughout the journey. That's all great. She's just cool, man. This old woman mentions Orange Kid, who we'll be getting to later. This girl on the third floor mentions having a boyfriend in Threed, the next town over, but we'll be getting to the conclusion of that much later. And back outside, this NPC in his car is hilarious. The house to the northwest is empty, except for this young boy who says his parents left him for Happy Village to meet with the founder of the religion there. We'll come back to this kid later, but I wanted to point him out. The human enemies are interesting, often wasting turns to be humans. But the crowning jewel of this group, however, has to be the new age retro hippies, who engage in some of the truly honest and most hilarious battles in the game, busting out toothbrushes to scare you with their incredible hygiene and taking out rulers just because. I think these battles are honestly some of the best encapsulates of EarthBound's entire vibe it's renowned for to this day, making even the wasted turns by enemies into something enjoyable. To the right of the department store is the Chaos Theater, which will catch the player's eye due to the crowd and the large signs all around it. The presentation of the building really makes the Runaway Five, the band playing there, seem special. At the store, one of the clerks will offer tickets to their show, but be sold out. Then the player sees a line outside their venue. It's small, but goes a ways in making their importance clear. The inside of the building has a downbeat country sound to its music, which helps give it its smoky, old-timey theater vibe. The cop outside this door will reveal the theater's manager is named Poochie Food, like dog food, which is just funny. Poochie Food will inform the player that the Runaway Five owe him a lot of money, and are working off their debt with their shows, ending by saying that is unless you decide to pay off their debt. A clear indication to remember them for later. The band leaders, Gorgeous and Lucky, are standing outside next to the building, that sort of back alley of the venue vibe, and they even reiterate the importance of the FemC. This sort of draws a line in the player's mind that finding her is the primary goal, and accomplishing that will eventually lead to freeing them, the secondary goal. This sign is also great, just some funny quasi-fourth wall breaking. This house will let you know Venus's house is next door. Though not a major character, this lets the player know she's at least someone of interest, and that she even has a name. At her house, her mother says she's left for the big city to become famous, something to remember for later. This dog NPC outside has some nice personality, and I appreciate how much this feels like a line out of the Peanuts. His character will actually even develop a little bit later. Heading south, the player will pass by Berglund Park, which has, quote, some cool stuff but seems pretty dangerous, clearly alluding to the word burglar, which is fitting seeing as there's a mini-boss here. Yep, heading into a certain part of the park will trigger a fight with Everdread, who's just kind of a strange guy. Not a tough battle, but he will try and steal items from you. How fitting. Beating him, he'll reveal the whereabouts of the female protagonist, and reveal that Pokey is in the mix of the kidnappers, along with this mysterious blue group. Something I've seen often glossed over is how they're intending on using her as a human sacrifice, adding some real stakes to the equation. He ends his spiel by telling the protagonist to come see him when he saves her. Strangely, this battle is not required. The park itself has some humorous dialogue and many shopping locations, including the introduction of condiments, which enhance the healing properties of food items, and is just overall a nice set piece for Twoson, and really helps accentuate its small town feel. This NPC even reveals Everdread to be a crime boss, implying he may have had some hand in the female protagonist's capture. Something I really like is the for sale sign the player can buy here, which allows them to sell their items at any time in exchange for one item slot. Pretty neat feature. While Onett and Twoson are both small towns, I think Twoson actually comes closer to that feel, while Onett is more like a suburb township kind of thing. This sign even supports that. I think it's the slightly warmer tones of the greens that do it for me, something very cozy and autumnal about its aesthetic. Reiterates that you're moving forward too, as visually it sort of evokes a sense of the day passing from afternoon to early evening. Arriving at Polestar Preschool, the void of FemC's absence is felt, with all of these kids expressing their concern, and by the change to more somber, worrisome music. Her importance is reaffirmed by her mother, saying it seems like she has a guardian angel, which is actually very subtle foreshadowing to something so much later I can't even begin to unpack it right now. Her father's reaction also instills a sense of fear, and staying in a hotel after meeting him will even trigger a cutscene of him searching the town in a panic. In FemC's room, there's a present with a teddy bear inside it. Just a cute character thing. Small thing, this sign just south is so ominous, I love it. Here, we reach the houses of Orange Kid and Apple Kid. Orange Kid's house is very tidy and he wears a suit. He speaks very formally, and for a $200 investment will give the player the Super Orange Machine, or the Suporma, which plays a song praising him, then immediately breaks down. This prompts him to get back to work. Apple Kid's house, on the other hand, is messy. He wears overalls and speaks in layman's terms. This contrast is highlighted by the use of the same theme for both houses. This creates a juxtaposition of the different classes they're from. With this, Itoi suggests the former are self-appraising to the detriment of their work, while the latter, the more blue-collar workers, who make up a majority of the working class, who Itoi has demonstrated several times he has a deep affection and appreciation for, get the job done, as we'll see later. Additionally, AppleKid asks for food before an investment, suggesting the working class as those working to survive beyond just solely monetary means. The trash can in the house also yields a broken machine, which the help command will say can be fixed by the third protagonist. I wish the wording was more vague, as this breaks the chronology of the storytelling and spoils a future mechanic, but I understand why it's this way, as that'd warrant a whole mechanic to be programmed to alter this dialogue box once he's in the party, so whatever. Investing in AppleKid triggers the mouse to block the exit. The mouse opens with, "I am a mouse, no one has given me a name yet," which is a reference to the 1906 novel I Am a Cat by Natsume Soseki, in which the line is said by a protagonist, the unnamed cat, albeit in cat form. The novel itself is a slice of life piece, which goes perfectly with the relatively lax tone of the game thus far. Additionally, this novel is also about clashes in Western culture and Japanese traditions, which also works perfectly with the entire work of EarthBound being American culture through the perception of a Japanese man. In this way, the reference is almost self-referential, suggesting possible inadvertent conflation of the two cultures even Itoi himself may be blind to. He gives the player the receiver phone. With the southern tunnel to Threed blocked off by ghosts, the only way left for the player to travel is east to Peaceful Rest Valley. And on this path there are— oh no! The cave reintroduces the sci-fi elements in its music, which helps segue directly into Peaceful Rest Valley itself, which has several alien enemies. This mole explains the role the gut stat plays, as well as the rolling HP meter mechanic. While I tend to prefer letting the gameplay teach the player, I'm more forgiving of this instance as 1, it's an optional dialogue interaction, and 2, these elements were brand new to this game, and there's a good chance players not using the strategy guide won't understand these things, as it's not immediately clear, and again, unique to this game. Additionally, the low amount of HP the player has had up to this point really hasn't allowed for efficient use of the ladder mechanic, but now with likely over 100 HP at this point, around now is the time it'll most likely actually start coming into play, so I actually really approve of this. Seeing the bridge is out, the player will continue to head north until they reach this, a pencil statue, blocking the path. Returning to Twoson, the player will receive a phone call from AppleKid asking that you meet with him. The mouse and orange kid will say he's in Berglund Park. There, he gives the player the pencil eraser, a brilliant pun which makes the iron pencil statue disappear. This sequence, I'm mixed on. It's a bit convoluted in terms of gameplay, as the player could have just as easily went to Peaceful Rest Valley prior to meeting AppleKid, got stuck, returned to town, then met him. This would make them, to my knowledge, have to go to the statue again, return to Twoson again, then get this call. Which is confusing as I'll get out. This is a small section of the game where I think the clarity is at its worst. While not awful, the path of events could have been sanded down a little bit. Luckily, many NPCs mention AppleKid and Orange Kid, so there is some direction to see them, but yeah, it's a bit clunky. Something I like about this is that AppleKid proves himself to be the better inventor here. This micro-arc is clearly about not judging a book by its cover, and it helps to make AppleKid more endearing to the player, and reiterates the rooting for the underdogs motif the story has. Continuing on through Peaceful Rest Valley, there are some intimidating enemies. This is a pretty notable difficulty spike in the early game, and I want to make special note of the territorial oak enemies. These guys, upon being defeated, will deal mortal damage before their defeat animation plays. Dying to this enemy can be prevented by simply mashing through the dialogue boxes to get to the "you win" message to display before their HP hits 0, and I think is actually a really good teaching tool for the rolling health meter mechanic. Other than that, the area itself is pretty straightforward. But I want to make note of how effective its aesthetic is in conveying a sense of pain that nature is experiencing. The nearly purple water is clearly meant to evoke a sense of poison running through the river, and the paleness of the green in the grass and trees makes it look like everything is dying. It feels like a place that needs saving. At the end of the area is a short cave with a few coil snake enemies. Now, why would the designers place such a weak enemy here? I interpret this as, again, an allusion to the serpent from the Bible. An entity that ushers in evil to all of humanity. The exact prelude to significant evil. Evil in this case is about to become much more apparent. Here, we enter Happy Village. The player is immediately ushered in with off-kilter music, suggesting mysterious, gloomy, and maniacal feelings. Here, everything is blue. Everything is shaded with blue as well. The previously mentioned paleness of the grass accentuates this, and the relatively darker color blue now stands out more against it. Blue is a color that directly contrasts nature in many aspects. It's a color not present in the vast majority of what's edible to humans in nature, with very few exceptions. Additionally, it's a color that's been associated with danger, sometimes even signifying poison. This understanding has engineered a revulsion to the color in that it feels unnatural and thus unsafe. It's dangerous. This place is dangerous. The people here all talk like they're literally hypnotized, even the cow. They speak very passive-aggressively. They're all praising a man named Mr. Carpainter. This man confesses that he was one of Femc's kidnappers. The only place here that isn't blue is the inside of the drugstore, but even their products are supposedly blessed. What is this place? At the counseling office, a few people are registering to join the commune. This includes a couple that say they came from Twoson and left their child. These are the parents of the boy home alone there, ironically not realizing their true happiness is waiting for them to return home. The only house that isn't blue is this red one, and has a strange voice coming from it. Maybe it'll be important later. There are wandering human enemies in this town and its connecting caves. The insane cultists. These are the followers of Happy-Happyism. The American localization removed the HH insignia on their hoods and added the pom-pom on the end of them, but there is no mistaking that they are a direct allusion to the Ku Klux Klan. There's a lot of symbolism, satire, and commentary here, so we're going to have to take it on bit by bit. I want to continue with the story a bit further before we get to all of that though. Moving through another cave, the players led to a cabin in the mountains surrounded by crows. Inside is the Femc. Paula's theme plays, which is an aural sigh of relief from all of the unsettling tracks that the player has been bombarded with up to this point. She tells the protagonist she dreamt he is to be her destiny. She also details Carpainter's intentions, and that if you didn't show up, she'd have to find a way to bust out herself. It's small, but I appreciate any characterization like that to show she's a tough girl. She then gives the player the Franklin badge, something they won't be able to defeat Carpainter without. Leaving the house, Pokey, along with some cultists, are waiting. Here, Pokey encourages the protagonist to join Happy-Happyism, though he knows he won't. Pokey also reveals he's Carpainter's right-hand man in all of this, and runs away, leaving the cultists and a spiteful crow to take care of you. This moment doubles as a progression of Pokey's own story, as well as strengthening what this section of the game is partially saying about manipulative groups, like cults. That they are often seen by their members as a way to escape their own problems, that it gives them somewhere to belong, and maybe will even lead them to eventual or immediate happiness. This is incredibly relevant to Pokey's character, as he has no home or group of friends, so he thinks, to belong to. He feels isolated and neglected, which is no doubt why he has such nasty character traits, negative feelings that led him to desire above all else somewhere to feel welcome. Even if it's solely to manipulate him into doing said group's own bidding. I think this really speaks to Itoi's own fears in regards to his daughter. He wasn't able to see her much growing up due to his divorce with his wife, which is actually what led him to creating the first Mother game, to connect to and with her through the medium. I think these feelings also feed into this part of EarthBound, that his large absence in her life will or would have led her to a lonely, hurt, and worse, destructive place. With the group of enemies defeated, it's time to head back to the village to confront Carpainter. Before heading to him, we should heal up, and luckily there's a house to stay at in town. The man running the bed and breakfast says he lets members of the family stay for $50 a night. The family being those interested in Happy-Happyism. By staying, he reminds you to do your blue chant before bed. As minor as this whole scene is, it feels unsettling. Though not a reference, it feels similar to something you'd see in The Wicker Man, where someone's staying a period of time in a place that feels off. Definitely has something evil under its hood. And having to pay and agree to an interest in the religion in order to stay, even if the protagonist is lying, it feels like you almost have to sell a piece of your soul, you know? Makes you somewhat frustrated you must agree to, due to the inability to formally speak for the protagonist. This is something that generates an internal frustration, I'll call it, in the player. This sense of control being taken away from the player creates this frustration. It's something that's often seen in movies in order to create tension, that sense of yelling, "turn around" during a horror film, or "just say you love each other" during a show. This feeling is necessary in order to keep the person experiencing the story invested. In fact, it's already been employed multiple times throughout the story, but I wanted to point out its use here to drive a sort of wedge between the player and their feelings about their own actions. It's small, but I mean it. Little things like this go a long way. All healed up, we make our way to the central house of Happy Village. Heading in, the player is brought to the heart of the cult. In this huge house, the player must make their way through a maze of cultists and fights with them to progress. The maze itself is significant to the part of what the game is saying about these sorts of belief systems, that they're easy to get lost and caught up in to those unaware of their true nature and intentions. While we sift through the maze, I think this is the time to address the many layers of the Happiest cult. As said before, their appearance is a clear allusion to the Ku Klux Klan, a domestic terrorist group that's existed in the United States dating back to the late 1800s. At large, the Happiest are a satire of those who believe in a sense of racial superiority, seen in that the god they worship and pray to is an arbitrary color, one that's meant to be ridiculous as it's one not reflected in human skin pigment. But there's an in-game subtext to this that is also important. This is the section of the game where Gygas's influence on humans can be seen, in that they will attack the player out of nowhere. What color are they? Blue. This isn't only significant in the literal plot points though, this is a setup for the deeper visual storytelling of the entire game. The game is setting up that blue equals evil, or at least possession by an evil influence. And this is something that will be reiterated visually as the game's story progresses, and it's set up here in a significant way, a literal cult to it. In this, subtextually, the Happiest are worshipping something much more clear-cut: evil. They wear nothing but blue. They are evil. Simultaneously, Itoi is voicing his views on a level of social commentary by clearly saying those who value something like racial superiority are worshipping evil, and themselves are evil. Them wanting to paint the town blue, itself being an obvious play on the phrase paint the town red, being them clearly conveying their desire to spread evil. But there's also something else to take away from all of this. Who else wears blue? The protagonist, as well as Pokey. Pokey we'll get to much later, but as for the protagonist, visually he's checkered with blue, almost literally. It's divided in lines, and creeps on the brim of his hat. So what does this mean? A lot of people complain about him having no character, but what I think many are missing is his story is being told visually throughout. This is something we'll discuss in greater detail throughout the rest of the story, but for now, what to take away is that the protagonist is not immune to Gygas's influence. He's not invulnerable to the effects or even carrying out the actions of evil. He's still human. This is intentional too, as none of the other mainstay party members wear any blue. This is something unique to his journey amongst them. Some might say, well, plenty of NPCs wear blue, that doesn't make them all evil. And they'd be right, they aren't all evil. But I think this speaks to the idea that everyone has a capacity to do evil, but aren't inherently evil themselves. Almost to say, perhaps these people are just more susceptible to evil's temptations. The last thing I'd like to mention about this room is this circle of cultists. I know many will think this is a ridiculous claim to make, but I genuinely believe this, and think there's clear evidence for it. The female protagonist was kidnapped and brought here, in Everdread's words, to be a human sacrifice. This is a cult participating in the worship of literal evil. It's made clear you don't have much time before this sacrifice happens, even suggesting it may already be too late. I believe this circle of cultists is the preparation for that sacrifice, in the style of some sort of demonic ritual. Through the next room and up the stairs is Carpainter with the Manny statue. He asks the protagonist to be his right-hand man. An interesting choice to give the player, especially seeing as it doesn't have any sort of impact on the outcome of the conversation. The battle starts either way. Why give the player the yes-no option in this scenario? As far as meaning goes, I actually have no interpretation. I just find it to be a very interesting choice on Itoi's part to have the player gauge themselves on how they feel about the happiest without any sort of consequence. This choice is never referred to later or anything either. It's purely to possibly make the player somewhat self-conscious over what they may pick. It melds well with the whole feeling of this location and feels like the proper apex to the section. In a place run by a cult, the ultimate question ends up being, would you join them? A question whose answer is entirely left up to the player to think about on their own after they've answered it. Following the choice, Carpainter shoots bolts of lightning at the player, which reflect off of the Franklin badge, a moment that would have previously teleported the player back outside the house if they attempted this confrontation before receiving it. From here, the battle begins. While this battle unfolds, let's talk about the Franklin badge itself. This is a study of the American localization of EarthBound, so we're going to disregard the lore that it was a badge worn by Benjamin Franklin during his experiments with electricity. Even then though, the name and affiliation with electricity alone, we can at least extrapolate a connection to Ben Franklin. So what significant connections are there? Well, Franklin was a polymath, a person whose knowledge spans a vast number of subjects. He was a writer, scientist, inventor, statesman, diplomat, printer, publisher, political philosopher, and probably many more. What I'm trying to say is he was a bright guy. Now, the connection between Franklin and the badge reflecting lightning are obvious, but what does this mean on a story level? Well, this badge deflects one of the most powerful forces imaginable, lightning, and is accomplished through the use of something affiliated with someone whose image is tied to overcoming and harnessing it. With this in mind, my interpretation is that this symbolizes overcoming the greatest challenges someone might be faced with through the power of knowledge. Let's face it, starting when you get to Twoson, the game gets a bit more complex in what it wants you to do to progress. It takes a bit more work than it did in Onet. It took some brain power to get this far. And it was done by talking to people, observing the obstacles, and putting the pieces together to move forward. It took knowledge. And look where you are now. After the battle concludes, Carpainter snaps out of his delusion. He mentions the Manny statue behind him, saying it was the cause of his actions. The statue was sold to him by Liar Exaggerate from Onet, and now its evil presence is making rounds through Eagleland. As it'll be seen later, the way in which the statue's evil influence corrupts people is different from place to place, but always in some way is connected to power. Because of this, I see the Manny statue as a symbol of the evil desires of man. We'll see more of this later. Carpainter concludes by giving the player the key to the cabin the female protagonist is locked up in. While the player walks back through the rest of the building, they see everything has immediately collapsed. I love how the emptiness of the room is pronounced by how the NPCs are spread out, and how the music changes after Carpainter is defeated. This NPC says, "It looks like almost everyone woke up and left," furthering their views were delusional, and it was nothing but a trance. Upon exiting the house, the music perks up and Pokey approaches, saying he too has woken up from his terrible nightmare, only to turn on you again. As subtle as this shows Pokey's growing malice, that even in the face of defeat, he'll taunt and refuse to see the error in his ways. The uplifting music matches the change of the town's atmosphere, with all the residents also having woken up. Back at the cabin, using the key from Carpainter, the female protagonist is set free. She says people in Twoson are probably worried about her, and that they should head back, which is something we'll come back to in just a minute. Leaving the cabin, the decision to place spiteful crows around here was a great touch, because when she's locked up, it gave off the vibe of death and that general backlash vibe of the area, especially given the extremely dangerous circumstances she was under. But it also makes it so that once she joins the party, she immediately has enemies to her scale and level so that the player can toy around with her PSI capabilities she has, while also not being in any real danger, as the male protagonist can easily deal with them if things get out of hand, which they won't, seeing as she joins the party with a teddy bear, adding an extra layer of protection, and also ties in with her cute girl character as well. Starting off, she only has PSI freeze, and quickly as she learns more moves, it'll become perfectly clear to the player that she isn't just some girl. She's a monster with PSI, sporting some of the strongest PSI moves in the entire game, especially her variants of freeze. It's also a chance for the player to discover she's not particularly capable when it comes to physical attacks. While the cool and strong but cute girl character is a trope by today's standards, this was nearly 30 years ago, and was still a really refreshing look at a character like this, especially given the game's unorthodox modern setting. Returning to Happy Happy Village, the vegetation has been restored to its natural green color, demonstrating the both spiritual and literal life the player has brought back to it. Now, something that sort of bothers me. Her introduction to the party strongly insists the player return to Twoson, but there's still something to do here. A sanctuary location. It's mentioned by a couple of NPCs as a place of interest, but the primary dialogue spoken by a protagonist generally outweighs those things, not even considering if the player even remembers those things that were said in the midst of what they just experienced. The player is likely to pass the cave leading to it on their way through though, so it's not a total failure or anything, just a case of some mixed messages. And again, to be fair, they do tell you. And this dungeon is also technically not required to do at this moment. It's just when it makes the most sense to. In the next area, Femc will be making much use of her PSI powers, and is going to be running low. Not even mentioning the main character, which is why it's thoughtful that the man running the inn now will let you stay for free for saving the village. Nice way to tie it in with the story. Into the cave, most of the enemies here are pretty weak, all things considered, with an especial weakness to Femc's PSI spells, like the mole playing rough, the first enemy you'll encounter, whose experience point yield is nice and hefty, instantly giving Femc a few levels right off the bat. She also rapidly gains new PSI powers to experiment with, learning her first PSI fire spell at level 3, and what do you know? Either path you take from here will shortly lead to groups of bat enemies, which can easily be dealt with effectively via this power that attacks an entire row of enemies. In fact, all the enemies in this area are exceptionally weak to her PSI. Even the much more dangerous mighty bear enemies crumble to PSI freeze. Additionally, if the player is faced with any critical danger, the town is right outside the cave, giving the player an ability to revive party members, a free place to recharge, and several reminders to upgrade their party's equipment at the shop. On the path to the boss, there are also several HP restoring items that the player can now carry with their extended inventory space, a respawning magic butterfly, the teddy bear that she has while she joined the party for extra defense, and a PSI restoring item just before the boss. All of this, and her quickly attaining new and more powerful PSI moves, this dungeon is meant to prop up everything that makes this protagonist so useful. And this isn't even taking into account that the male protagonist has several powerful and restorative spells to utilize as well. On to the boss, Mondo Mole, I have some thoughts. Though the female protagonist PSI works on him, suddenly throughout the entire dungeon where she's been super useful, it's much less effective. Now her PSI Thunder spell is much more effective, and I think that is meant to hint to the player to try the main character's PSI Paralysis spell that they're likely to have by this point. But I don't think this is overly clear, and with that can make this a pretty annoying early game boss who hits hard and heals himself constantly, and will likely drain the party's PP, with players initially probably using their custom PSI move since it was very effective on the previous Sanctuary Guardian. On the other hand, however, Mondo Mole's weakness to paralysis is crippling to the point he will not be able to land another hit for the rest of the battle once it lands. But without using it, it's highly likely your new party member won't make it through the battle, missing out on a lot of experience, driving the difference in levels between her and the other protagonist even further, resulting in the battle being either too easy or really challenging. Luckily though, that gap can be accounted for a bit once the location is reached and all the enemies run away, making accumulating more experience even easier than it already was. Exiting the cave's other side, the player reaches the Lilliput Steps. The main character sees a vision of a baby in a red cap, more foreshadowing for later. The Lilliput Steps are a reference to the 1726 novel Gulliver's Travels, also known by a really long name by Jonathan Swift. In the novel, the Lilliputians are a race of tiny people, about 8 inches in size, which is why the Lilliput Steps are so small. Furthermore, the Lilliputians are a people who put great emphasis on trivial matters, much like how the Happy Happiest dedicated themselves to a color. This also continues the steps motif the giant step in Onett established. further playing on its big step on your journey by more or less calling these baby steps, with how small they are. Now, let's finally head back to Twoson. The path back through Peaceful Rest Valley is much easier now, with our new friends PSI also being highly capable of dealing with them. Territorial Oaks are still a pain though. And look at that, the bridge is back. Back in Twoson, the first thing to do is take our friend back home to see her parents, which, wouldn't you know it, is right on the direct path when you return. Talking to her mother will result in her giving the player the Hand-Aid item with restorative properties. I just wish she had more of a reaction to her kidnapped daughter returning home, like her dad does in the next room. A pretty emotional scene plays out of their reunion, and he even follows you when you move around after until you basically tell him to knock it off. It's a nice touch and heightens the emotions of the scene a little bit more. When she returns, the music also changes here from the more worrisome track Before to Home Sweet Home, also known as Pollyanna. This is notable for also being the same theme that plays in the protagonist's home, and symbolizes both the deep connection between him and her, as well as this place becoming effectively a second home to the player, which gets some more follow-through in-game much later. Leaving her house, presumably one of Everdred's henchmen meets you outside, saying he's looking for you, reminding the player that he had previously told them to come see him once he saved the girl. He also says Everdred's got something for you, making it clear it's important to meet him. Visiting Everdred, he gives you $10,000 in the form of the Wad of Bills item. Also given in a nice character-y way, with him saying he can't hold on to the money anyway, implying he got it through some suspicious means. He ends by saying he's off to learn more about the Manny Manny statue, even name-dropping Liar Exaggerate, confirming this is the same statue, moving from town to town. This may also remind the player to revisit the Runaway 5, conveniently just up the street. Talking to Lucky, or Gorgeous, we still don't know who's who, seriously, will result in him giving the player the backstage pass, since we're cool and have a girl now. Heading into the venue lets you meet a wide array of characters, angry adults, clearly drunken adults, a funny follow-through on the guy in the lobby, Runaway 5 fans, haters, and groupies. This game is so realistic. The lead men of the Runaway 5 themselves were changed from black suits to their red and green suits in localization to distance their image from the very clear illusion that they are to the Blues Brothers, now more resembling Mario and Luigi, which works as both are Nintendo properties. Itoi cited the Blues Brothers as one of his biggest inspirations when creating EarthBound, and the dry humor focused on old-timey American pop culture, and even the hate groups clearly demonstrate that connection.
I hate Illinois Nazis.
Not diving into an entire Blues Brothers film analysis right now, but if you ever wanted to see a movie that's humor was like EarthBound's, this is the one. Leaving the green room, the show starts. The prelude even directly references the Blues Brothers' perhaps most famous song, Soul Man. I also know that Soul Man is a title given to a lot of jazz performers, but come on, they're clearly references to the Blues Brothers. An underappreciated joke about the Runaway 5 is the fact that there's actually 6 of them, as they always have a touring musician with them, the keyboardist. Really subtle to the point I can't even blame most people for not noticing it. In Poochie Food's office afterwards, the player needs to show him the wad of bills given to them by Everdred. Now this might seem somewhat nitpicky, but I find it really stupid that you can't show him the wad of bills across the desk. It even triggers situational dialogue where he tells you to bring it closer to him. I just don't see why the next cutscene can't just start from here. The only conclusion I can draw is to keep the party out of the way of the band since they immediately enter and stand in front of the desk, but like, couldn't the party just move out of the way automatically once the cutscene starts? Anyway, with their debt paid, the Runaway 5 are free men and offer to drive the party to Threed, the next town. On the way out, there's this NPC standing in front of the showroom door who I don't think anyone has ever talked to, but is here solely to keep the player on the path of leaving the building. And outside, before we go, I want to do a couple things. First, this dog from earlier has new text. "You're fantastic. You even take the time to talk to animals." This is so ridiculously charming. Not only a great line, but also some actual development for a seemingly random dog NPC. But he's no random dog NPC. He's a good boy. The other thing I wanted to show is that this kid's parents have returned to him, and they're a happy family unit again. And all's well with everyone now that they've snapped out of their delusion too. And that's about it. This is just really sweet. From here, joining the Runaway 5, through the power of their uncontainable groove, take the player on a ride through the ghosts, too intimidated by their pure, unfiltered funk, and into Threed.